Today I am sharing my thoughts on Shadiversity's newest video in his newest series, Functional Fandom, in which he asks the question, can you shoot a bow from a tree like a ranger or elf? Stay tuned. Greetings, adventurers. I am Kramer, and I am very excited for Shad's newest series here. It's right up my alley, very excited to see what else he comes up with. And I'm even more excited that now I have the ability to respond and be part of the conversation in more of a capacity than I was able to do before. Let me know if anybody else feels this way, but for some reason in my mind, response videos have sort of a negative connotation, and I don't know where that came from, and that is not at all how this video is intended. In fact, I am proceeding with the assumption that Shad has already thought of everything that I am about to say. I'm really more using his video as a jumping off point just to voice my own thoughts and opinions. It's not a rebuttal or anything like that. So ultimately, I agree with Shad's assessment that using a medieval European longbow, a warbow, that is the height of a man with a draw weight of around 100 to 120 pounds from a tree is not a fantastic idea if you can even pull it off to begin with. Shad starts off the video by saying that the longbow is the logical choice that an adventurer, a medieval adventurer, would use, and that is why it is the baseline in his test for this video. He then later says in the video, though, after testing out the longbow in the trees, that using a shorter bow is easier and makes more sense, provided that the short bow is still viable for combat. And he makes the point that this might be why we see cultural differences in bow styles, say between elves and humans, if elves are more likely to be shooting from trees than humans are. I agree with that latter assessment more than I do the first one, that is that shorter bows make more sense, not just for shooting from trees, but for shooting from unconventional positions to begin with. And I'm of the personal opinion that in a world where adventurers or rangers existed, shorter bows would have far more prevalence than I think they're given credit for. And that we would see them far more often regardless of race or culture. And I'll expound upon that idea more in my response to Shad's Ranger Kit video, because that is also something that I'd very much like to take part in that discussion. You know, we all love Rangers, we're all trying to unravel the mysteries of what it must have been like in our theoretical world. Still talking about the longbow, Shad in his video, before testing out the tree shooting to begin with, also makes the point to compare how bows are portrayed in movies and TV versus how they would look being used with historically accurate draw weights and sizes. And for anyone who's unaware, I am both a medieval enthusiast and also an actor, so allow me to weigh in here real quick. Shad is correct that in the filmings of movies, the actors are not given historically accurate weighted bows. They're using bows that, as he guesses, are between 5, maybe 15 pounds max. And that is not only to keep the actors from tiring out, but it is also because the bows aren't actually being fired. They're being dry fired because all of the arrows, spoiler alert, all of the arrows that you're seeing fired and hitting other people on screen, they're being added in post. So in order to keep the bows from breaking under the stress of being fired without the energy being put into a projectile, the bows have to be a lighter weight. And I'll also just state again my opinion for the record that I would love to start seeing more historically accurate weapon styles be represented in film and TV. But it also depends on what the story is that needs to be told. So in his video, Shad said that if you are an actual archer and you know how real archery is done, seeing how archery is done in movies tends to break your immersion. And I agree with that to a point, but it isn't always true. Now, I am an actor and I am also someone who does archery. And depending on what it is that I'm watching, my immersion isn't always broken. Especially for fantasy movies, it is a lot easier to suspend my disbelief within reason, of course. I mean, if the example that he showed of I don't remember what the name of the video game was, but you just had someone literally just like barely any movement at all. Yeah, no, with that obviously would break my immersion. In historical drama, watching a soldier struggle and strain with the weight of a 120-pound warbow would add to the atmosphere. And if I am ever in something that is historical like that, that will obviously be the route that I choose to go unless the fight director or whatever tells me otherwise. And I do love when fantasy is grounded in realism to a degree, because that also helps build the atmosphere, but not necessarily at the expense of the story. Take Lord of the Rings, for example. So my immersion isn't broken there, and that's partially because I'm biased, and also partially because the story of Legolas as an archer isn't, look how powerful Legolas's bow is, it's, look what a fluid, dexterous, graceful archer Legolas is. And having that sort of dancer-like, effortless archery style tells that story better than if every time he needed to loose an arrow, he had to take the exact correct position and really breathe in and use every muscle. It just doesn't flow as easily. And on the one hand, while watching someone effortlessly pull back an arrow and then loose it without any strain whatsoever tells the story that the bow is actually just very weak, it could conversely also just tell the story that the archer is very strong, very well practiced, and very competent. Is it fully believable? No. Does it tell the story that they're trying to tell? Yes, absolutely. And that's setting aside the fact that 1, Legolas isn't using a long warbow, and 2, you don't need a 120-pound draw weight as long as you're shooting a razor-sharp arrowhead and you hit the person in a lethal spot. 40 pounds is enough, 30 pounds is enough to injure a person. Shot placement is what's key. That being said, there is absolutely no excuse in my mind for holding the bow at full draw through dialogue or through entire scenes. It is a sin, stop it, it should be banned. So the question at hand specifically is not just can you shoot bows from unconventional positions in general, but can you shoot bows from a tree specifically? And Shad states, and I agree, that a shorter bow would be easier to do in this scenario. But setting aside what type of bow you have, what type of bow you would theoretically use, and whether or not you'd be able to shoot that bow from a tree, I would just like to beg the question, why would you do that in the first place? Now, I understand why Shad made the video. We're talking about a trope. It's not as if I'm questioning why he literally made the video. I understand. I'm just wargaming now within the question that he's already asked. Is there any strategic or mechanical advantage to shooting a bow from a tree in the first place? And that's not necessarily a rhetorical question. I am going to attempt to answer that question in this video, but I'm also asking everybody else what you think. Because if you wouldn't do it, even if you could, then it's still just a trope. But we know that there are some people that do shoot their bows from trees. Modern hunters have chair platform setups that they can rig up in the trees, so we know that it is done to a degree. The reasons why I can think of that an archer might want to shoot from a tree are that it potentially offers some level of concealment. It might be more comfortable, especially in the modern day, if you have one of those nice chairs that you can tie up in the tree. It is potentially protective, especially if you're hunting animals that would be a threat to you on the ground but cannot climb trees. And it offers you a wider range and field of view. You get to take in more of the environment. But when it comes to hunting, the assumption is that we are firing at a single target that isn't going to be a threat to us. And we're not planning on receiving fire. And if you are, then Shad said, and I agree, that shooting from a tree is a terrible, terrible idea. Even if a tree were to afford you some level of concealment, bows aren't silent, which means that the second you fire your first shot, the advantages of being in the tree disappear almost immediately. So in this case, I would say that shooting from a tree only makes sense if you are literally hunting, if you are hunting a single humanoid target, or if you in a group of people are hunting a group of humanoid targets, and you're not actually planning on getting into combat. You're essentially just assassinating whatever your target is and then leaving. Because once they pinpoint your location, you now no longer have the advantage. You are now a prisoner stuck in a tree, and nothing is preventing them from shooting back at you, and even if they don't have ranged weapons, nothing is preventing them from throwing rocks at you. They don't need to incapacitate you. They don't even need to injure you. They just need to knock you out of the tree. Gravity will take care of the rest. Now, there are stories and accounts of various sharpshooters throughout history climbing into trees with their rifles to take long sniper shots. The question is, could you do that with a bow? Maybe. Could you do that with the bow that you would effectively be able to wield whilst in a tree? That's a different question. In the Desolation of Smaug, when Bilbo and the dwarves are escaping in their barrels from jail, we see that there are elves that are hopping from tree branch to tree branch, shooting down at the orcs, chasing everybody, and, you know, that's a cool shot. And they have mobility whilst also having the high ground in the trees. Now it's starting to look a little bit more viable. Unfortunately, even if you're playing an elf in a game, or if you're reenacting as an elf, I'm willing to bet you can't do that. That's nothing personal. I can't do it either, certainly not in the terrain that I'm in with the types of trees that I have, but it's just not something that most people are capable of doing, and therefore not something that most human adventurers would be capable of doing. Now, I'm sure that there's one or two people that can do it. I'm just saying generally, we're not hopping tree branch to tree branch, not using our hands for balance, and then shooting at the same time. It's just not happening. But a similar scenario where a human character did do something like that is from The Patriot, where Benjamin Martin staged rifles all along the tree line and almost single-handedly wiped out an entire platoon of redcoats, and did so efficiently and so quickly that they actually thought that there was more than one of him for the majority of the battle. That is absolutely something that I can envision an adventurer or a ranger doing in that sort of disruptive guerrilla-style skirmish. But he wasn't in the trees. He was hiding behind them. They afforded him far more cover, too. So if shooting from treetops doesn't really offer any advantages for us mortals, but it does offer concealment potentially and surveillance, now we're starting to narrow down the reasons why you might find yourself in a treetop. Going back to The Hobbit, Bilbo climbed to the top of a tree in Mirkwood not because he wanted to enter combat, but because he literally couldn't tell what direction he was headed. In terms of concealment, I would argue that there are far more advantages to find a concealment in literally any other form of terrain than up in the treetop. That would allow more mobility and a method of escape should something go wrong. But something that isn't covered in Shad's video at all, because of the way the video was structured, he is shooting from trees that are already on the ground so that he can just be in them and then demonstrate safely. That's very fair. And we'll cover that in a second. But how are you even going to get into the tree in the first place? Setting aside whether or not you could do it, or if you would do it even if you could, how do you get into the tree? Modern hunters, I believe, especially in my area, they're not climbing the trees, they're pulleying themselves up. They need ropes in order to get up and in order to get down. And if we were talking about a tree that was low enough to the ground that you didn't need a pulley system in order to get yourself in and out of the tree, which is certainly not mobile, we first have to ask the question, if the tree was low enough that you could climb it, are you in danger of other people also climbing that tree? Also, why would you choose to find concealment in that tree, which is obviously climbable, than literally any other place if you were in a forest? But even if the tree was low enough to the ground that you could climb it right now, how well could you climb that tree in your full battle kit? How much of your kit would you have to take off in order to climb even an easy tree? How much of your kit would you be willing to take off in order to climb an easy tree? I don't think I would be able to climb a tree with all of my adventuring gear on, backpack and everything. Probably not with a sword. And even if I were to strip off everything and stage it at a different spot underneath a bush somewhere so that I could grab it later when I needed it, even if I only had a bow, a short bow, and any type of quiver, I don't know that I would be able to climb even the most perfect tree effectively and then dismount mid-combat without being killed. Originally, when I was planning this video, I was going to run a series of tests where I progressively, starting from a full kit, unload things to see at what point I am able to effectively climb a tree. Then I realized that because it's something that I'm not well practiced in, that anecdotal evidence would show nothing other than that I, a person not experienced in climbing trees with medieval kit on, am not capable of climbing a tree with my medieval kit on. So then I thought, okay, I'll practice it a little bit and then I'll do a follow-up at some point. And then I thought, why in the world would I spend time and risk life and limb practicing something that doesn't even work really on paper just to prove that it can be done? I mean, if I were to fall on a knife or a sword or one of my arrows or even the tip of my bow, I could seriously injure myself. Even if I didn't fall on any of those things, I could break one of those things, or I could break some other part of my body, or a carrot maybe. I don't know, but it just doesn't seem like the risk is worth the reward. And I don't know why any adventurer would practice this very specific and frankly dangerous skill that has such limited applications that it's essentially a gimmick. So shooting from a tree seems like something that you might accidentally find yourself having to do as a last resort, but I really don't see it being something that you would ever plan on doing. It just doesn't seem worth it. For instance, when Bilbo and the dwarves were running out of the caves in The Hobbit to get away from the orcs that were chasing them, they climbed trees. They had ranged weapons, they had those pine cones, and depending on what source we're going with, maybe some of them had bows, but they didn't plan on being up there. That was a last resort because they didn't have the numbers to defend themselves on the ground. All it did was buy them time. They still had to be air-vac'd out of there by the eagles. Merry and Pippin, while they were running from that one orc in the two towers, they climbed trees in order to try to get away, and it didn't work. The orcs still got Merry, and the only reason why they were able to escape from that scenario unscathed was because the trees were sentient. So I'm struggling to even find fictional examples of when being in a tree was an advantageous position. Ultimately, this topic for me has boiled down to I don't know, if you're still watching, we have spent so much time discussing whether or not we can do this, and didn't take a moment to think about whether or not we should. Now, a much more viable method of using the treetops to your advantage, I think, would be rigging some sort of distraction or crossbows up in the trees in order to make your enemies think that they were surrounded in the treetops while you ambush them from the ground. It's a lot safer, I think. I mean, sure, you have to get the stuff up there, but even if you were just to shake a branch with a rope that you threw up there, I think that's a pretty viable tactic. Let me know what you think. So, my fellow adventurers, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the video as we collectively here attempt to reconstruct a fantasy world that never existed with as much authenticity as possible. I hope to see you in the next video, and in the meantime, good luck on your adventures.